Chapter 6. An exciting appointment. The Hoover girls walked out to the barn with Nancy. "Do come to see us again," Grace called, as the young detective climbed into her car. "Yes, please do," Allison added. Nancy promised that she would. "As soon as I have some news," she said. Although the weather had cleared, the river road remained muddy and slippery. Nancy found it necessary to drive with extreme care for the next 2 miles until she reached the main highway. No wonder this river road isn't used much, she thought. And how do Grace and Allison get to town? Nancy wondered. She had not seen a car at the Hoover home and knew that no bus passed their door. I certainly wish, she thought, that I or somebody else could locate a later will of Josiah Crowley's, by which the Hoovers and the Turners would receive some much-needed money. I must tell Dad about this latest development. She decided to see if her father was in his office and drove directly there. Nancy parked the car in a nearby lot. She surveyed the convertible ruefully as she climbed out. Poor thing, it certainly needs a bath. Nancy found Mr. Drew in. As she entered his private office, he arose from the desk chair to kiss her. "I'm glad you're here, and safe," the lawyer said. "I was worried about you when that violent storm came up. When Hannah phoned me that you weren't back, I began to regret I'd sent you on the errand." His daughter grinned. "I'm back, all in one piece. I delivered the papers to Judge Hart and learned that he and his wife saw Mr. Crowley in Masonville a couple of times. Also, I talked to the Hoover girls." She described her meeting with Allison and Grace Hoover and ended by asking her father if he could help them. "From what you say, it does look as though Josiah Crowley might have made another will, which included them as beneficiaries," Mr. Drew commented thoughtfully. "I'll be glad to do anything I can to help the Hoover girls." He asked whether the sisters had given Nancy any specific information about Mr. Crowley's habits or other helpful clues. When Nancy shook her head, Mr. Drew suggested that she invite the girls to his office for a little conference. "Perhaps if I ask them some questions, it will recall helpful incidents." The lawyer studied his desk calendar for a moment, then looked up at his daughter. "How about tomorrow afternoon at 2:45? I can give them about half an hour." For answer, Nancy gave her father a hug and then asked if she might use his telephone to call the Hoovers at once. Grace and Allison eagerly accepted the Drews' invitation, and Nancy said she would drive out to bring them to the conference and take them home afterward. "You're a doll!" cried Allison, who had answered the telephone. "Nancy, I just know you're going to solve this mystery." Suddenly, an idea came to Nancy. She asked Allison how long the girls would be able to stay in River Heights. "Oh, as long as you need us," Allison replied. "Good. Then I'd like you both to stay and have supper with us," Nancy said. "Sorry I can't join you," Mr. Drew told his daughter as she hung up. "I have a dinner engagement and conference in the evening." Just then, the mayor of River Heights was shown into the lawyer's office, and Nancy arose to leave. She spoke to the mayor for a moment, then said, "See you later, Dad." Before Nancy returned home, she stopped at an old-fashioned house on a side street. It was the home of Signor Mascagni, a famous voice teacher who had retired to the small city the year before, but took a few outstanding pupils. Nancy introduced herself to the white, bushy-haired, florid-faced man, then said, "Signor Mascagni, would you be willing to listen to the voice of a friend of mine and give your honest opinion as to whether or not she might become a great singer? If she might, and she can obtain the money for lessons, would you be able to take her as a pupil?" Signor Mascagni studied Nancy for several minutes before replying. Finally, he said, "You do not look like the kind of girl who would come here on a foolish errand. Ordinarily, I do not accept beginners, but in this case, I would be willing to hear your friend sing." He laughed. "Mind you, I will give you nothing but the truth, and if your friend does not measure up, I hope her feelings will not be hurt too deeply." Nancy laughed too. "I like honesty," she said. "As a matter of fact, this girl knows nothing about what I am asking you. Coming here will be a complete surprise to her. I'm probably no judge of voices, but I think she's a natural. However, we will both appreciate having your opinion, and will certainly abide by it." She arranged for a meeting the following afternoon at 4:00 and left Signor Mascagni's house in an excited mood. "Maybe I'm going way out on a limb," Nancy mused. "But this is another one of those hunches of mine that Dad talks about, and I must carry through." When she picked up the Hoovers the following day, Nancy did not mention the appointment with the voice teacher. The three girls went directly to Mr. Drew's office, and at once he began to quiz Grace and Allison about Mr. Crowley. "I understand that he was a rather eccentric man," the lawyer began. "Suppose you tell me everything you can remember about what Josiah Crowley did and what he said, which would help us figure out where he might have secreted a later will." "Uncle Josiah was rather absent-minded," Grace spoke up. "I often saw him hunting for his spectacles, which he had pushed up on his head." "Did he ever hide things?" Mr. Drew asked. "Oh, yes," Allison laughed. "Uncle Josiah was always putting articles away in what he called a safe place, but the places were so safe, he never could find the things again." "Then," Nancy spoke up excitedly, "Mr. Crowley could have hidden a will and then forgotten where?" "I suppose so," Grace replied. "While living with the Tophams, I'm sure that's just what he would have done. One day when he was calling at our house, he talked about the Tophams and the way they were trying to get all his money. I guess they think, just because I stay on, that they're going to get everything. But they'll be fooled when they find I've made another will," he said with that odd little chuckle of his. "This time I'm not going to trust it to any lawyer. I'll put it away in a place that I know will be safe." Allison asked Mr. Drew, "Do you think Uncle Josiah hid another will somewhere in the Tophams' house?" The lawyer looked down at his desk for several seconds before replying. "If he did, we would have a great fight on our hands, I'm afraid, trying to persuade the Tophams to let us make a search." Another thought had come to Nancy, and she shuddered at the idea. Perhaps the Tophams had been alerted by all the talk of a later will, had searched for it, discovered one, and by now destroyed it. She flashed her father a questioning look and got the impression that he had the same thought. But there was no point in discouraging the Hoover girls by telling them this. Mr. Drew continued to question the sisters until 3:30, then said he had another appointment. He would do all he could to help the girls and would not charge them for his services. "Unless they bring results," he added with a smile. "You're very kind, just like your daughter," said Grace, as she arose and shook hands with the lawyer. "You have no idea how much Allison and I appreciate what you're doing for us." When the three girls reached Nancy's car, she told the sisters she wanted them to meet someone special in town and drove directly to Signor Mascagni's home. As they went up to the front porch, they could hear the sounds of a soprano voice singing an aria from Tosca. "How beautiful!" Allison exclaimed softly. The girls were admitted by a maid and asked to wait in a small room while Signor Mascagni's pupil finished her lesson. Puzzled, Allison waited for Nancy to explain. "I have a surprise for you," Nancy said with a grin. "Signor Mascagni has promised to listen to your voice. If you pass the test, he'll consider taking you as a pupil. That is, after we find the money for voice lessons." Allison was too dumbfounded to speak, but Grace cried out, "Oh, Nancy, what are you going to do next? We've known you only 24 hours, and you've already boosted our morale sky high." At this moment, the door to the studio opened. The young soprano came out, followed by Signor Mascagni. He said goodbye to his pupil, then invited the three callers into the studio. Nancy quickly introduced the Hoover sisters. "And you are the singer," the man said almost at once, addressing Allison. "I can tell from your speaking voice." Apparently the teacher sensed that Allison had been taken by surprise and was a little nervous. Accordingly, he began to talk on other subjects than music. He showed the girls several paintings in the room and pieces of statuary which had come from Italy. "I prize them highly," he said. "They are exquisite," Allison remarked. Signor Mascagni walked to a rear window and pointed out a lovely garden in back of the house. Then, evidently satisfied that Allison was at ease, he led the way to the grand piano and sat down. "Now, what would you like to sing?" he asked Allison with a smile. "Please stand right here facing me." "Something very simple," she replied. "America the Beautiful?" The teacher nodded, asked what key she would like it played in, then began to accompany her. Allison sang as though inspired. Her voice sounded even more beautiful than it had at the farmhouse, Nancy thought. When Allison finished the song, Signor Mascagni made no comment. Instead, he asked her to try a scale, then to sing single tones, jumping from octave to octave. "You have a very fine range, Miss Hoover," was his only comment. For half an hour, he had Allison try short songs in various keys, and at one point joined with her in a duet. At last, he turned around on the piano bench and faced Nancy and Grace. "I believe," he said slowly, "I believe that some day we shall know Allison Hoover as an operatic star." Before the girls could say anything, he jumped up and turned to shake Allison's hand fervently. By this time, the full import of his words had dawned on the young singer. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. "Bravissimo! Bravissimo!" he exclaimed. "You sing, you cry, you smile. Magnifico! You will also be a dramatic actress splendida." Nancy and Grace were nearly on the verge of tears also. They were so overwhelmed by the happy news. Then suddenly, the three girls became serious, remembering that there was still the problem of money for lessons from this great man. They knew his fee per hour must be very high. Allison suddenly began to talk and poured out her whole story to the white-haired teacher. "But I know," she declared with a brave smile, "that somehow I'm going to get the money for the lessons, and I wouldn't want to take them from anybody but you, Signor Mascagni. I'll come back to you just as soon as I can. Thank you very, very much. Please, girls, I'd like to leave now." As Allison rushed toward the front door, Signor Mascagni detained Nancy and Grace. "This Allison, she is wonderful!" he exclaimed. "I want to give her lessons to see that her training is correct." He threw up his hands and shook his head. "But I cannot afford to give the lessons free. Perhaps I could cut my price." "We'll find the money somehow, Signor," Nancy promised. Then she and Grace thanked the teacher and followed Allison outside. At the Drew home that evening, there were mixed emotions on everyone's part. Hannah Gruen had taken a great fancy to the Hoover sisters, and the news of Allison's talent had thrilled her as well as the girls. Conversation at supper was gay and animated. Nancy and Mrs. Gruen drove the sisters to their farm, and on parting, Nancy again promised to do all she could to help find a will from which the girls might possibly benefit. But figuring out how to do this became a problem that seemed insurmountable to Nancy. At breakfast the following day, Mr. Drew suggested, "Nancy, perhaps if you'd give your mind a little rest from the Crowley matter, an inspiration about the case might come to you." His daughter smiled. "Good idea, Dad. I think I'll take a walk in the fresh air and clear the cobwebs from my brain." As soon as she finished eating, Nancy set out at a brisk pace. She headed for River Heights' attractive park to view the display of roses, which was always very beautiful. She had gone only a short distance along one of the paths when she caught sight of Isabel and Ada Topham seated on a bench not far ahead. "They're the last people in the world I want to see right now," Nancy thought. "They'll probably say something mean to me and I'll lose my temper. When I think how Grace and Allison and the Turners could use just 1/10 of the Crowley money, which the Tophams are going to inherit, I could just burst. Nancy had paused, wondering whether she should turn back. No, she told herself. I'll go on to see the roses. I'll take that path back of the Tophams and they won't notice me. Nancy made her way along quietly, with no intention of eavesdropping on the two girls. But suddenly, 2 words of their conversation came to her ears, bringing Nancy to an involuntary halt. She had distinctly heard Isabel say, "the will." In a flash, Nancy's detective instincts were aroused, and her heart pounded excitedly. It must be Josiah Crowley's will they're talking about, she reasoned. End of chapter 6.